Good morning, everybody. I have with me Senator Black today. We will be speaking about the new news pertaining to Cuba. We know that the capture of Maduro kind of had this trickle effect into what was going to happen with Cuba. And as of the 29th of January, you had Trump issuing sanctions, further sanctions, and a threat of 100% tariffs on any country that is facilitating oil or gas into the country of Cuba. I want to pass it off to you, Senator, to kind of give us a quick little briefing on that and kind of what we wanted to talk about today, which was pertaining to a particular article that kind of goes into some of the ramifications if we were to continue this escalating tension with Cuba. I think we saw that in the first Trump administration with Venezuela when we issued sanctions on them because of the when we considered the election null and void and placed Juan Guaido in power. You had over 7 million people flee the country with those sanctions that ended up kind of crippling the country. 7 million people, they fled south and north up into America, or the United States, excuse me. So I wanted to kind of extend this to you and see if you wanted to comment on this.
Yeah, we're focused a little bit on a very good article, a short article in Forbes magazine, well, Forbes.com, and the article was entitled, "With Cuba on the Ropes, America's Unready for Massive Cuban Exodus." The story of Cuba goes back to around the time I was graduating from high school, and you had the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Soviet Union had put nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba, and they were targeting Washington, D.C., New York, different places, and it caused an enormous national crisis that eventually was resolved after a blockade and a standoff, very tense period, and finally there was kind of a rather secretive agreement where the Soviet Union agreed to withdraw its missiles. The United States agreed that we would withdraw our missiles from Turkey, which was on their border at the time. Americans were not told about the removal of the Turkish missiles, because we were all hyped up that we have been offended. These missiles are off our coast, which certainly that was a very offensive thing. But what we weren't told was that we were doing the same thing with the Soviet Union over there. So in any event, it was resolved with kind of an agreement that the United States would not invade Cuba, and so this is all sort of a package deal. And so in any event, what happened is we've had this kind of semi-blockade on Cuba ever since. It's not a formal blockade, but we've cut Cuba off from all sorts of support, but it's been a very fragile state for many years. But what makes it especially so now is that the White House we've cut off the oil coming from Venezuela, which was a huge subsidy to Cuba, and we put pressure on Mexico. So at first it was a little unclear whether Mexico would cut off their oil, but it looks like Mexico is doing it. So it would seem that it's just a matter of time, because the economy of Cuba is so fragile that the automobiles that they drive there, the newest cars are from 1959, which was around the time that this blockade started. And so this beautiful, magnificent city of Havana, it's still there, but it hasn't been repaired, for, almost 3/4 of a century. So that's where we stand today. And I know you've got some more information about what's going on related to this.
Yeah, you kind of alluded to that. There has been United States sanctions placed on Cuba for over 60 years. And so much so that they are very isolated out of the community, of the international community, through the hegemonic power of the US dollar. There are independent observers that have reported back or that come out of Cuba to report that, the power outages, the influx of people who are begging for money, is kind of drastic to see from the capture of Maduro in December. You see this really high escalation of everyday people kind of suffering, which I find is very unfortunate. And we were kind of discussing backstage is this, there's no formal plan to try and usher in what some people want to perceive as a regime change. So much so that we have what happened in Venezuela, where you have Delcy Rodriguez, who was the vice president essentially under Maduro, is now the stepped up as the president, and she's kind of being hailed as kind of just now we're in the same position as Maduro with she's this new dictator, and I find it very unfortunate. I think that is kind of with the national security strategy was spoken about this premise of respecting sovereignty, and we kind of see that not really happening. We have some reports but some stances from politicians that are admitting to the fact that through these sanctions you will see the suffering of the civilian population. You have Maria Salazar, who put this X post on the same day that Trump issued the strict tariff and the new sanctions, kind of quotes with the highlighted portion that says that you will see hunger, but it's kind of the dilemma that we must face as the diaspora from Cuba. We have to kind of push that in the back of our mind to see a free Cuba. What are your thoughts on some of the people that are going to get caught up in this foreign policy that we are taking in Cuba?
Well, it is unfortunate. I was very involved actually in the revolution and so forth because my father was he was an internal revenue agent who, he would go to Cuba and he would audit the big hotels, the casinos, all of the wealth creating areas of the Cuban economy, and the mafia had control of this. It had total ownership, and so I was there a couple of times before Castro, and then once after Castro, and I remember I was just a young boy. I don't know how old I was at the time, but I probably started off when I was, 12 years old, maybe. And then towards the end, maybe I might have been 15. But I recall that my father is a very charismatic guy, and a lot of the American expatriates and various sort of Cuban intellectuals would get together at his apartment, and they would, they'd party and they'd talk politics and so forth. And I can recall, well, I can't remember the words. I recall that initially they would talk about this man Fidel Castro, who was up in the mountains with the with the rebels, and that he was headed this way. And there was sort of a divide in the people who would come there, and there were those who would say, well, maybe he would bring some good things, maybe he'd bring some improvement. And then you had another group that was fearful of what he might bring. And and then I recall that after Castro, immediately after Castro, while things were still in a tremendous state of flux, we had similar meeting. And at this point, there were no people defending Castro. There was just this tremendous sense of fear. Now, backing up, before Castro had captured Havana, and when he was still up in the mountains, at the time, I was probably, I don't know whether I could have been 13. Every time I mention it, the numbers vary because I can't remember the exact age. But I had my little sister, my baby sister, was with me, and the two of us were at some great hacienda with an area of all sorts of trees and so forth within this great big area. And we were walking through this, and I'm holding hands with my little sister, and a woman, a middle-aged Cuban woman, came walking by us, and she saw, she could tell we were Americans, and she came up and she pretended as though she were machine gunning us, and she just, she didn't speak English, we didn't speak Spanish, and she just came up to the children, and she went da 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 da, like she was killing us. And I've always been interested in foreign affairs and the differences in cultures, and I just recall being fascinated by this woman who would feel such a sense of hatred towards us just because we were different than she was.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so that this was sort of, I recall all of this unfolding, and sort of going back to the Forbes article, they point out a very important historical event that occurred after Castro was well entrenched. He'd been in power and was sort of at the peak of his power almost. And what happened is there were waves of immigration out of Cuba because communism is not a successful economic policy, and I'm not talking about like communist China, which has a capitalist economy and a communist government, but if you have a truly communist economy, it fails. It's just almost by definition. But it hadn't failed at this time, and Fidel Castro was sort of riding high on what he had taken over. But still, the common man was, having difficulty making ends meet. And so there was a sudden out-migration that began. And Jimmy Carter was the president at the time, a very weak president, very indecisive, and he did not take action immediately to stop it. And so it evolved into something that was known as the Mariel boat lift. This was in 1980. It was a presidential election year, which was very interesting. And what happened is there generated this huge movement of people fleeing Cuba, coming to the United States. And Fidel Castro said, okay, you know what? You're putting pressure on us. You're encouraging people to flee the country. Two can play this game. And so what he did is he just completely emptied out the prisons. Not, he didn't empty them out of political prisoners, but the murderers, the rapists, the robbers. He put them on the boats. He cleared out all of the insane asylums. He put them on the boats, sent them to Miami. Now, Miami had received a very large exodus of educated Cubans who came very early. They were the first ones. They were wealthy, they were educated, and they settled in Miami and had no difficulty. Actually, they run Miami today. But this was a different group of people. And when they hit Miami, crime skyrocketed. It's never gone back to where it was back in prior to the Mariel boat lift, because criminals tend to beget criminals. And the same, tremendous burden was placed on the city of Miami in terms of welfare, law enforcement, and so forth. And in the end, it played a major role in the election of Ronald Reagan, because 1980 was the year of the election. It was a major issue in the presidential campaign, and there was this perception of Jimmy Carter as being a very weak leader, weak on controlling the borders, weak on immigration, and it may have been a decisive issue in the turnover of the presidency and the election of Ronald Reagan as a very strong president. So I think where we are right now is we've kind of done what we're going to do, and it looks very likely that that we may just topple Cuba over. Mm-hmm. And the problem is there is no plan, and I think the Trump administration had better figure out what they're going to do, because during a midterm election, they do not want another Mariel boat lift with, hundreds of, 100,000 or more people flooding into the United States, overwhelming the whole social system in Miami.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would like to probably play a clip of after the events that happened on the 29th. You have the president, Miguel Diaz-Canel of Cuba, coming forth saying that he would prefer to have, or would be open to peace talks, but under conditions that they are not held with intimidation by the U.S. government. So I'll go ahead and play the questions that were presented to Caroline Levitt the other day, the 5th.
Thank you, Caroline. Cuban leader Miguel Diaz-Canel said today that Cuba would be willing to engage in dialogue with the United States only without pressure, without preconditions, on equal footing and with respect for sovereignty. But his government is denying what President Trump said, that they are already holding talks. How would you respond to that?
I think the fact that the Cuban government is on its last leg and its country is about to collapse, they should be wise in their statements directed towards the President of the United States. But as I just reiterated, the President is always willing to engage in diplomacy, and I believe that's something that is taking place, in fact, with the Cuban government.
So I wanted to play that because it reminded me kind of what we were a few months ago when we were speaking about the supposed, or the maybe the ramping up of kind of escalation with Venezuela. That Venezuela was actually very receptive to the U.S. in their talks, so much so that you had Maduro say that they would promote contracts for oil with American companies over Russia and China. You kind of see this same kind of stance with the Cuban president, saying that they would, like to have diplomacy over intimidation. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I'm sure that Cuba is to the point where they're kind of willing to do whatever they have to do. I think that Venezuela was probably stronger than Cuba,
Mhm.
just because Cuba is worn down from so many years. My son has traveled to Cuba with his family, and I was supposed to go when Trump was first elected president, but it became kind of awkward because I was in the Senate at the time, um, and and Trump was being a little bit bellicose towards Cuba. So I thought,
Mhm.
"Oh, I better not. I don't want to be on the news about this." But I really had a tremendous interest in going back and just seeing what has happened. Because I am so familiar with Havana and sort of the layout of the city and so forth. Um, but I think, as a practical matter, now there is law and order in Cuba, so um, there is not some organized opposition at this point.
Mhm.
Um, the interestingly, there's a very low level of violent crime in Cuba. There is some petty theft and that kind of thing, but it's pretty minor. Um, so it's kind of surprisingly stable internally, but but people have to eat, and at a certain point, once we cut off the oil, I just don't see a way that they can survive. And you know, I mean, I would say, I was extremely um, antagonistic towards the Cuban government because I watched what they did. They hauled innocent families out. Anybody at the peak of the revolution, anybody who had a gripe with somebody else could accuse them of being a counter-revolutionary. A mob would emerge. They'd drag them off to a place called the Wall, and they would scream, I think it was "Perdón, perdón," to the wall, to the wall. They take the mom and the dad, the grandparents and the children, and they drag them to the wall, and they just gun them down, one after the other. I don't, nobody even knows how many people were just slaughtered, and the guy that's on all the T-shirts at the colleges. I can't remember his name, but anyway, he was a great big revolutionary hero, and he oversaw the executions at the Wall, and he said, in a revolution, you do not need evidence. All you need is the accusation. Now that was pretty telling because that is exactly what justice meant under Fidel Castro. So, I mean, so many generations have passed that it's hard to feel animosity towards the skeletal remains of the Cuban government. Um, I just, I think where I am uneasy with the level of global turmoil and just this frenetic activity of overthrow this one, overthrow that one.
Mhm.
But I do think that regardless, better be thinking through. You know, President Trump has been most proud of his immigration control, which has been enormously successful, just stunningly successful, and it's not going to be a good scene if all of a sudden the president who slowed the border down to 5% of the former uh, intrusions suddenly has, 250,000 people flood across the border into Florida, destabilizing the Miami area. So
Mhm.
they better think this thing through, and they better be prepared. If the Cuban government falls, we better be prepared to move in there very promptly and make sure that the people are fed, that there is law and order. And I wish that we could do something with the Cuban government to create a transitional situation so that it wouldn't just collapse into chaos. I don't think that benefits anybody in the United States, and it doesn't benefit certainly anybody in Cuba either.
Yeah. Kind of zooming out and looking at broader pictures, we see this kind of escalating tensions with countries not directly with Russia and China, but that are in alliance with Russia and China. We saw that with Venezuela the day before we took Maduro. You had an envoy of the Xi Jinping's special envoy making over 20 contacts of cooperation with Maduro directly. So much so that it's I believe the envoy actually left prior to the kidnapping of Maduro. It's same thing with Cuba, and with Cuba you have Russia and China that have a strong alliance with that particular country. I also want to pivot to Iran. Iran also has this alliance with Russia and China, and broadly speaking, to zoom out, you have the BRICS alliance. That seems like that is truly what we are confronting. And instead of being, in my opinion, strategic about it or trying to combat it in a productive manner, we are kind of taking this hammer and nail approach that has not worked for us in the past. What is your kind of take on that, Senator?
I would tell you that, George Bush began attacking the Middle East. This was supposedly the war on terror. We had been attacked by Al Qaeda. They brought down the Twin Towers. They hit the Pentagon, and we were going to get even with Al Qaeda. And we proceeded to attack every country that opposed Al Qaeda, every country that cracked down on terrorism, and we allied ourselves with the biggest promoters of terrorism on earth, with Saudi Arabia, with Qatar, with Turkey, and nothing has worked. Everything that we have done since George Bush went in, Barack Obama picked up the torch. He got waving around his Nobel Peace Prize, and then just proceeded to slaughter people, invading Libya, invading Syria, invading this place and that place, invading everybody. And it's just, this Nobel Peace Prize, it's probably appropriate that Nobel was the inventor of dynamite, and he was, his wealth was from explosives, particularly military explosives, and so he was somebody who had been involved in mass slaughter, and so it's probably appropriate that Nobel Peace Prize goes to people who carry out the slaughter and use all of these high explosives to do it. Mm-hmm. But in any event, there is no country in the Middle East that has benefited from United States activities, with the possible exception of Saudi Arabia, which is probably the most fierce dictatorship on the face of the earth. Our close allies, we're always saying, "Oh, we got to bring democracy to Iran," and we'll do it in conjunction with Saudi Arabia. It's such an absurdity, but Douglas McGregor, who's a friend of mine and who's somebody I respect a great deal, he believes we have about a week before the U.S. attacks Iran. I know RT News they're taking the position that we will be attacking Iran. You never know until final decision, but the U.S. is involved in peace talks. And initially they were supposed to take place in Istanbul, Turkey, and Iran said they didn't want to do that. They moved it to Oman, which I think is probably a much more secure place.
Yeah.
Because we have been obedient to Netanyahu and the Israeli approach, which is you use peace negotiations to launch surprise attacks. That's the way Israel does it, and you use peace agreements to continue your attack while the public is sort of confused about, well, we thought this was over.
Yeah, maybe that's what we're seeing in Gaza. And then last year, it happened with Operation Spiderweb, and I can't remember the operation that we did in Iran. Was it Midnight Hammer, or was that Israel's operation? Where we had that same playbook where we were in.
I think we Midnight Hammer when we attacked.
I just couldn't remember if that was Israel's declared operation or if that was ours. So pardon me for not having that clarified. But that was their playbook. That was kind of like what we did and with Russia and with Iran. And I personally object to that because I find that doesn't show that we have good faith in these conversations, and that really sets us up in the long term to not be trusted, to not have like diplomacy over aggression. So I take great offense to those actions, and I don't find them to be kind of these military successes. That is kind of what the people will lead you to believe, that it's something that we should be proud of, as opposed to kind of embarrassed about, because you're supposed to have this, we are this superpower, we're supposed to conduct ourselves in a certain type of manner, I would hope. And when we kind of do those actions, it really shows that we're playing dirty. I know that you're not supposed to take such a naive stance, but I think there is this kind of middle ground that you can take where you are supposed to, at the very least, not be plotting for the demise of a president or such during peace talks. So yeah, I just wanted to make a mention that we had this.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying and what you're feeling is that nations, they operate from power, but at the same time, as Americans, we wish that there were some general moral principles to what we do. I think that's sort of it's human nature to feel that way. And unfortunately, I think the people who do foreign policy, they purge themselves of any moral compunctions, and morality is something you use to sell things to the public, and behind the scenes you do whatever you have to do. I don't know. At some point, I worry that we're going to step on a landmine. And, when we attacked Afghanistan and we invaded it and occupied it, we spent, enormous time, people getting killed over there. And in the end, we had created virtually nothing. And when we left, the country collapsed in no time, just in a period of months, after this enormous effort by the United States to prop up this primitive country on the other side of the planet. Now, Afghanistan had 40 million very poorly educated, rather primitive folks. Iran is a much different place. Iran, it's more than double the size of Afghanistan, population-wise, and the population are they're very intelligent people. This is not a primitive society by any means. It's very bright, and you look at their arms industry, for example. They've managed to do very well with producing modern ballistic missiles and this kind of thing. Um, and everyone sort of agrees that if they somehow toppled the present government, there wouldn't be anything to build on.
Mm-hmm.
It just could devolve into chaos, and I don't see any benefit to the United States or to the world in having that happen. Now, Israel, I mean, they would take over the whole planet if they could. There's no end to what they want, to the, what they want to take from this country, from that country. And so unfortunately we're doing their bidding, but I think if we could turn away from that, I'm a Republican, and I think about the midterms. I don't want to have a washout in the midterms.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's an uneasiness within the country, within our country, about this frenetic foreign policy aggression, this, demanding this, bullying that one, putting tariffs on this one, just creating this sense of turmoil and uncertainty and fear around the globe. I'm not comfortable with the United States simply being the biggest bully on the planet. And I worry because we had emerged into sort of a multipolar world where there were, China had its interests, Russia had its interests, the United States and other countries. And we're moving back towards a unipolar world. And the problem with the unipolar world is what the nation of Rome discovered when they finally defeated their arch enemy, the Carthaginians. Mm-hmm. And they invaded Carthage, and they killed everyone, and they salted the fields and destroyed it forever. The problem was, at that point, Rome was so dominant, there were no enemies. Nobody could stand to Rome. And it was at that point that Roman democracy collapsed. And it was at that point that Rome was a very moral nation or empire. It became an empire, but it had extremely strong moral values. It was a very stoic society. And then we began to have these various emperors, and you had people like Caligula, who just was this depraved despot who, just murdered people at will. And the problem with power is that if you reach a point where no one can stand up to you, the next step is you turn on your own people.
Yeah.
And that's what I worry about from a much more global, universal perspective. Is I want us to be a very powerful country, and particularly within our hemisphere, but I'm not naive enough to believe that we should be fearful of our own political system.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to become so dominant that we can then turn around and say, okay, now we've got some gripes with these American people. Let's start settling scores there. We've got all of these, particularly there's always this tendency to go after the people's basic moral values and to hammer away at those and to try to destroy them. And so that's the kind of thing that concerns me, and that's why I don't really have any feelings for or against the Iranian government, but I have a great deal of sympathy for the Iranian people, and I also don't believe that I, as an American, have any role in deciding what government will be in charge of the people of Iran.
Mm-hmm.
This is not my business. And I wish that we would sort of look at it that way and draw back from what we seem to be about to do.
Well, I admire that outlook, Senator. I truly do. And to an extent, I know a lot of people who subscribe to the MAGA movement. This is the complete opposite of what they sought for. They sought for what they subscribe to is this America First, where you see this administration really taking, kind of putting us in the backseat and kind of taking on a new pet project in another country of, we got to bring them democracy and development. And so I understand where you're coming from, and it's felt by a lot of people. So with that, I know we're about over with the show, but I know that you wanted to speak maybe on domestic news that came out of.
Yeah, there were just a couple of things I'll touch on. There was something. It's a very small article, but there is a case that's working its way through the courts in Virginia, and there is a former candidate, a Democratic candidate for Virginia House of Delegates, and she has pled guilty to submitting bogus claims for financial relief under the COVID bailout. You recall that during COVID, the decision was made that we would simply flood the country with enormous quantities of debt money, and we did that. And this was done in a way that would facilitate fraud. And I think it was deliberately done to make sure that there would be no checks and balances, no fiscal controls over the money, so that we would really facilitate fraud. And of course, we've seen this with this massive $9 billion Somali fraud up in Minnesota. And I think what's interesting about this case in Virginia is that it shows that this is not something that is limited to Minnesota. It is something that was a tool that was used to enrich various parts of the Democrat coalition, I think, and we know there's a lot that's gone on in California, and typically there's tremendous resistance to any federal oversight within these states where the frauds are taking place. But it's out there. It's the whole COVID financial scheme really has bankrupted our country and put its economy in some danger. So I think I just thought it was interesting, the fact that case had come to light in Virginia, and here it was, somebody running for political office, tied in with the political establishment, and so that was one thing. I'd like to commend to people an article. Oh, by the way, before I forget it, many of our listeners will not be familiar with the fact that the Washington Post newspaper has just laid off almost a third of its entire staff of reporters, and it just announced this. Jeff Bezos he's the owner of the paper. His paper has been losing money. Newspapers have just the devil of a time functioning these days. And while I almost always have had great differences with the Washington Post, I am uneasy with seeing any of these newspapers collapse, even the most liberal ones, because even if they had a very slanted view of things, they would present facts. They'd report on something, and they'd have various facts that they would present accurately. And that information was of great value to whether you were conservative, liberal, or what. And the demise of the newspapers, it may be inevitable, it may be an economic consequence of things, but I was kind of sad to see that. Even though I've always had stark differences with the Post. But right now, ironically, I'm commending the Washington Post for an article that it published that I thought was very insightful. It was an opinion piece by Megan McArdle. I don't know anything about her other than the fact that she wrote this article published in the Washington Post. And it was entitled, "The Transgender Orthodoxy is Cracking." And it says, malpractice suit and shifting clinical guidelines show cracks in transgender orthodoxy. And it began by talking about a very recent court decision. A jury on January the 30th awarded $2 million in damages to a woman who, while she was just a 16-year-old girl, was given what they call gender-affirming mastectomy. Where they came up with this term, gender-affirming implies that somehow they're they're helping you be what you are. Okay, so they could do something gender-affirming to make me more masculine. They could do something gender-affirming to make you more feminine. But they can't do something gender-affirming that tries to deny your biological reality. And so I find that term gender-affirming extremely political and extremely offensive, because it's not gender-affirming at all. But anyway, she had a mastectomy when she was 16. She was given $2 million in damages. And immediately on the heels of that, the American Society of Plastic Surgeons came out with a paper. They recommended waiting until age 19. I think what they're saying is everybody connected with this hideous practice of sexually mutilating children is suddenly saying, whoa, the potential for lawsuits is so enormous. It's a little bit like when the cigarette companies finally came under the eye of the trial lawyers, and the trial lawyers just gobbled them up and took the wealth of the cigarette industry away. here, this transgender surgical business is so much more offensive than cigarette smoking ever was, that there's this risk that the tide will change with a resounding boom. It was an interesting comment that the drafter, this is a fairly short article, and she's talking about the public orthodoxy of transgenderism. And she said, public orthodoxies that diverge from private opinion may be surprisingly stable, but they can also prove remarkably unstable because they depend on private thoughts to stay private, and in order to give the illusion that people who doubt the truth of what they're hearing, as long as you can keep them silent, then the individual just feel like they're sort of out of step with the world. And then she goes on, she goes on to say, each skeptical voice makes it more likely that further doubts will be raised, triggering a rapid shift to a new equilibrium. And then this is interesting. She says, if you've wondered how communism collapsed, that's how. And if you've wondered why communist regimes are so oppressive, that's also your answer. When you are the custodian of a fragile orthodoxy, you cannot afford to allow a hint of dissent. And then she goes into the history of this transgender movement. She said back around 2015, an orthodoxy on transgender issues crystallized seemingly out of nowhere. And it was very sudden. All of a sudden, you had this bizarre notion that a man who put on a wig and put on some falsies or something, that he was a woman. He had become a woman by virtue of dressing in a woman's dress, and a man or a woman who did the opposite. They suddenly changed their gender. And then she goes on to say that it became transphobic to suggest that some spaces, like locker rooms, prisons, or sports, should be reserved for biological females. And then she talks about the medical business, and she said, boilerplate assertions that pediatric medical transition was evidence-based and medically necessary and even life-saving began appearing everywhere, despite the fact that there really was very little proof to support what was going on. And it was interesting that I posted a comment. Now, usually the Washington Post has been very, very good about, even if you have great difficulty with their position, they post whatever you put up. But the orthodoxy is so powerful surrounding this transgender surgery that this got kicked out. Now, I'll read you what the Post said after I read you mine. Here's what I wrote as my comment. This is just my opinion. There are 1,000 opinions, and this is mine. And I said, sexual mutilation of helpless children is a crime against nature. Such crimes should be punishable by death. Future generations will find it impossible to explain how children's organs could be sliced off for profit and how this could take place with full knowledge and complicity of the medical profession. Few horrors committed by mankind have ever matched the utter depravity of transgender surgical mutilation. Well, the Post came back and said, your comment is likely to be rejected. Please review community guidelines and edit it. And so if you wonder how this orthodoxy begins, it shows up with this comment. I haven't accused any individual of doing this or doing that. It's just a very strong opinion that that this practice, which I'm sure by the time that you are middle-aged, people are just they're going to be dumbfounded at the very notion that you could drag your little boy down to a surgeon and have his genital organs removed just because you thought it's kind of cool. It's kind of the swinging thing to do. People, I hope that we have the moral composition to where people will look and say, my God, how did we do that? How did civilized people accede to that type of thing? So anyway, it's interesting. I strongly recommend the article to people just because it is thought-provoking. Megan McArdle, and this is the Washington Post on the 6th of February. So that's the local news for the day.
Excellent. Thank you, Senator. Do you have any concluding remarks? No, you touched on a lot today, from Cuba to Iran to the, domestic policies and changing of, of what you've just spoken about. Do you have anything to set us, leave us off for the week before we catch back up next week?
Well, I think we can all just say a prayer for the people of Iran.
Mm-hmm.
Let's draw back from this. Let's don't send in the jets, send in the bombers. It's time to just lay off and let the world cool off a little bit.
Yeah. Focus at home and maybe development and stuff like that. And I agree with you. And I admire your stance on a lot of things, Senator. So I want to extend my greatest gratitude of being on this show with you. And I would like to encourage everyone to tune in next week to focus on the news.
Thank you.